Today's session is being moderated by me and Rami Abu Khalil. I'm very, very excited to introduce our special guest today, Dr. George Junne. Professor Junne did his PhD at the University of Michigan. He is a professor at the University of Northern Colorado. His work focuses on African Americans and film, the Black American West and the Civil War, general African American history, culture, and the blacks of the Ottoman Empire. He is the author of The Black Eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire, Networks of Power in the Court of the Sultan. That's the book we're going to be talking about today. Dr. Junne, thanks so much for joining Africa Conversations.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here.
I guess the best way to start is just to ask you a little biographically. You aren't, you're not Turkish. You didn't grow up immediately exposed to the Ottoman Empire. Most of your work focuses on sort of the African American experience. What led you to this area of the library, so to speak? How did you find out about this stuff? How did you become compelled to write a book about the subject?
Well, this started in about 1998. An organization I belong to here in the United States. It's a national research organization, and I was in charge of the African American component. And I received there was a woman in Istanbul who wanted to make a presentation on an African American author. I said, this is strange. The Turkish woman wanted to present on an African American author. And she was from Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. And so Aslı Tekinay was her name. And I accepted her proposal. It looked very good. And I took a couple of friends of mine to her presentation, and it was outstanding. Mm. So I congratulated her on the wonderful presentation of this author. And then she said, well, George, why don't you come to Istanbul some summer and teach? And I used to tell people, I thought about that for 5 seconds. I said, yes, what do I have? Because Istanbul was one of those names that jump out. There's been movies about Istanbul and radio shows and everything like that. So I just wanted to see what it was about. Then when I went to Istanbul, I found out about, through some friends of mine, about the Black Eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire. And I just kind of fell into it. I wanted to find out more.
What was the thing that surprised you the most when you heard about them that made you say, oh, I don't want to just look into it, I want to actually write a book about it?
Well, what happened was that a friend of mine from the United States, a professor, visiting professor, we were wandering around Istanbul and went to a place, and there was a tomb of a Black eunuch, a chief Black eunuch. And so we went back from there to a reception that was being held on the Boğaziçi University campus. And a buddy of mine there, John Freely, who's now deceased, he was a professor, American professor there for years. And we had talked before, and he says, George, we ought to do a book or something together. And for a joke, I said, yeah, maybe something on the Black eunuchs. And he looked at me and he said, George, that's a great idea. Hardly anyone done anything on this. And went on and on and on, and I'm shocked because I thought I just told a joke. And then I started doing some research in the year 2000 when I was first there, and came up with all this information and stuff like that, and things that went against the stereotypes. And so it just went on from there for a few years. Every time I went to Istanbul, I started gathering more information, interviewing some people, gaining access to libraries and so forth. And I was just amazed at what I found out.
Mm-hmm. And maybe for everybody on the call who maybe doesn't know your book as well, when I first came across the title, I thought, oh, Black Eunuchs, you must really be talking about the stories of just a few individual peoples amongst just a random sea of eunuchs. But actually, Black Eunuchs was a specific category of eunuchs. So can you talk a little bit about that? And just for everybody who may not know that position specifically, what is a Black eunuch?
Yeah, Black eunuchs were from Africa. Now, the Ottoman Empire, they also had eunuchs from Europe. Mm-hmm. But the ones from Europe, what they did, they castrated them. But the Africans were completely emasculated. So as boys, they had a couple of eunuch factories in Ethiopia. So the boys came from all parts of Africa, and they would end up at these eunuch places. And people doing the emasculation would grab everything between the boys' legs, take a long knife, and chop everything off. And then they would bury them in the sand. And then after a couple of days, they would be buried up to their necks, and they would come out, and they would give them water. And if they urinated, they were fine, they would live. But if they didn't urinate, it's because scar tissue had already built up and they would die soon. So the most expensive eunuchs, the most expensive slaves in the Ottoman Empire were the African eunuchs, because their death rate would be sometimes as high as 90%.
Wow.
So that's what I was looking at. And then in the palace themselves, there were eunuchs in the royal palace with the royal family. There were at least a couple hundred eunuchs at one particular time. However, there was only one chief black eunuch at the time. And the chief black eunuch of the Sultan was the third most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire.
And when we say at the time, George, here we're talking about, as I understand it, there's a specific period at which black eunuchs sort of become popular at a certain point. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that transitioned from sort of European eunuchs, because European people were enslaved by the Ottoman Empire as well, but how does that transition happen, and what makes it suddenly more desirable to have an African enslaved person as opposed to a European enslaved person?
Okay, there were African eunuchs and European eunuchs, as you correctly point out. But the position that I was looking at, for the most part, was the chief black eunuch. And there was only one chief black eunuch at a time. So the Ottoman Empire starts off, and they heard this making eunuchs from the previous empire. That they didn't start it. It was from the previous empire, and they kind of inherited. So with the white eunuchs in charge, they were there till 1574. And what happened is that because they were from Europe, because they could contact their relatives and so forth, they were able to bring relatives and friends into what is now Istanbul and form these coalitions and gain power. And at some points, they could even go against the Sultan. But the African eunuchs, being so far away, would not even know if they had any relatives in the Ottoman Empire at all. And so they could not form these coalitions very easily against the Sultan. So because the white eunuchs, the European eunuchs, had done such things that the Sultans didn't like, in 1574, they stopped after the death of a powerful white eunuch. They put the black eunuchs in charge so that they did not have to contend with the power struggles against the white eunuchs. And again, there was only one chief white eunuch in charge, and there were hundreds of black and white eunuchs there. And then when the chief black eunuch he came, there was still a couple hundred eunuchs. And then as the slave trade, as international talk against the slave trade began, particularly Great Britain, there were less and less white eunuchs total, and then more African eunuchs.
George, so I have three very simple questions that I think would help me sort of get a sense of the broader history. One, how does the history of sort of the slave trade related to black eunuchs how did that sort of exist, maybe in parallel to the other sort of slave trade coming out of Africa into the rest of the Ottoman Empire? So that's the first sort of question. Said differently, were there other slaves that were not castrated and sort of brought to be, laborers as well? And did those sort of trade routes exist in parallel? The second is, when you talk about the Ottoman Empire, are you specifically only talking about Istanbul as the center of it? Or did this happen throughout Egypt and the Levant and sort of other parts of the Ottoman Empire? And the third, I guess, sorry, and the third question, just to round it out, is when you talk about sort of the courts, was this specifically in the sort of the political courts, or were these just the wealthy elite as well? When we talk about sort of Ottoman society,
Okay. Well, the international slave trade, of course, took Africans all over the world, wherever the European bases. So, and also the other part that I worked on somewhat later is that there were Muslim slaves who came to the United States and to Central and South America as well. So there was a trade with Africans in general. The New World slave trade, they didn't care what religion they were. But with the Ottoman slave trade, because they were looking for boys, young boys, before they reached puberty, they were actually taught Islam and were converted, if you want to use that term, into Islam. But in other parts of the world, they weren't looking for that. They wanted laborers, field laborers. So there were mostly men that were taken, less women. In the Ottoman Empire, for instance, they chose mostly women in general as slaves to be servants, concubines, and workers and everything like that. So there were lots of different reasons for that. So that's one of the differences that you would see in the slave trade. But still, one of the things that you also have to be careful for, and one thing I was trying to research, is that no matter what, as a young person, you're taken away from your family. You don't know if they're living or dead, where they are, if they know about you, and so forth. But if you're a European slave, you can remember the town, the village that you're from, and you could get messages, perhaps, back to your family. It may take years, but you could do that. Well, the African slaves were completely cut off. Now, your second question was?
When you talk about the Ottoman Empire, are you specifically talking about Turkey, modern-day Turkey? Or were these eunuchs all over the Ottoman Empire in the sort of 18th?
How widespread is this practice?
Yeah, completely over the Ottoman Empire, because there are stories that are written down about some of the eunuchs doing in Egypt, for instance. And one of the stories tells about a slave, a eunuch that they wanted to punish in Egypt, but they couldn't punish him because he was under the direct control of the chief black eunuch in Istanbul. So they had to send him to Istanbul for punishment. They couldn't touch him. So all over the Ottoman Empire, wherever there were, the Ottoman Empire extended, there were eunuchs there.
This was a practice that was both within the court, like you was saying, but also within elite households, or was this really just a kind of, was this just part of the political system?
Well, every rich person who had a harem, he had a eunuch. Mm-hmm. So it was all over. So there were thousands of eunuchs in Istanbul in the 1700s, for instance. Wow. So every person could have at least one eunuch, if not more. But in the Sultan's household, there were at least in the late 1800s, the two census that they took in the palaces, just in the palaces, there were at least 200, just in the Sultan's family. So the people that were scattered all over.
So I was reading somewhere about this idea, and I think it was part of an excerpt from your book, talking about how, despite there being so many, and despite some of the the chief black eunuchs or these people being integral members of households essentially, but that as a sort of society didn't allow them to integrate into sort of Ottoman society. Is that right? Is that a fair representation?
Yes, that is true. They were not allowed to, if they worked for the palace, they had to stay within the palace and follow the directions of the Sultan. They had certain duties. So the chief unit was in charge of everything that went on in the palace, but also they were consulted for international affairs of the Ottoman Empire. And they were the bookkeepers. And they kept all the investments of the Sultan and the women of the palace. And then there were others that had specific jobs, like holding the stirrup of the Sultan or lighting the Sultan's pipe or whatever. But they were all different kinds of positions within. But the chief black eunuch was responsible for all of the other eunuchs. And in the harem was responsible for the actions of everyone, the workers in the harem and also the women in the harem. So that's why the person became the chief black eunuch, was the third most powerful person in the Ottoman Empire. And they helped to raise the Sultan. They helped to train the Sultan's personal guards. And they were also, because they were neutered, they could go, there were the only people that could go, except for the Sultan, from the women's side to the men's side and back and forth. So they could make sure that the women were doing what they're supposed to be doing and so forth, and then go and look and make sure that the Sultan's personal guard was being trained and everything like that. So they were responsible for a lot of things. And that's how they were able to gain power. And some of them had their own secret networks that were out there, keeping spying on the things that the government was doing and what the people were doing. So it was, and as far as money is concerned, in today's money, some of them would be worth millions of dollars.
George, you talk about that a little bit, and how that was perceived almost as an absurd contradiction from when European observers would see that phenomenon, because they would see a black person in, you know, what they would consider a position of power in a way, and a position of influence, even though they were enslaved, and, you know, nothing that they had could be passed down through generations, and they had no families, and they were completely uprooted, and they were absolutely enslaved peoples, but they also had a lot of influence and a lot of power. And so to European observers, that was just completely absurd. They didn't understand how you would give that much power to a black person.
That's true. And that they were always shaking their heads, you know, the black people are stupid, they're ignorant. How in the world could you do this? And even some of the Ottoman people themselves had that idea as well. So it wasn't Europeans. And so, so many of the eunuchs and other black people that were slaves or even free people, they were not really accepted by a lot of the Ottomans. And the Europeans thought that was just crazy. It's completely nuts to do that with these people. So they were ostracized, and people were jealous of them because they had power positions and they lived inside the Sultan's palace. They had food, they had all these different kinds of things that they were able to do. They were being paid.
It's so funny because I'm not a huge Star Trek fan, but I feel like this concept of this like fallacy of the wise, harmless, modern, like ethical modern eunuch, it exists in sort of pop culture, and these otherized foreign beings that you sort of import who are, you know, anti-sexualized, they have no sexual impulses, they're just wise. Do you feel like when you were in Turkey, this history is stuff that people can talk about? Is this forgotten history that people are not trying to sort of reconcile? You know, I currently live in a place that used to be the Ottoman Empire. I've never heard of this, you know, until recently. What was your experience with sort of, you know, local academics or local just folks? Did they know about this? This is not too long ago, obviously.
Right. Well, John Freely, the person I mentioned, he had done looking into that, not writing about it. And he remembers when he first went to Istanbul to teach, he was a physics professor, he remembers seeing some of the black eunuchs walking around Istanbul at that time. And so he wondered about that and did some digging on that and was able to help me get started on it. He wasn't interested, he had other things to do, so he wasn't writing specifically about them, but he was the one that pointed me in the right direction. And then I went to several libraries, the Ottoman library and this library and that library, and I was able to find records. So it's not that this stuff is hidden away in a sense, is that people aren't asking the questions, because there's a lot of material that's there, and they're in at least 5 languages. And so you have to kind of pull these things together. I don't read Ottoman. My Turkish is barely anything, but I got friends who are faculty members, and I even paid some people to translate some of the material. And at the libraries, I found people to help me to find the materials and stuff like that. So the material is out there. It's just that there does not seem to be an interest on the part of many people to investigate because they don't know that history. so they're not going to look for it.
Aditya, do you want to, you can unmute yourself and ask it if you'd like.
Sure. So it's a two-part question, and it might be naive, but if I'm conflating the history of the eunuch community in South Asia, the Hijra community, did the Black Eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire form their own separate social or religious identity to place themselves in daily life outside of their duties bound by the laws of the regime? And then the second part is, are there remnants or lineages of the community that perhaps survive today?
The eunuchs did form their own groups. And they also, not only with the eunuchs, but with other Africans. So when the empire ended, the eunuchs got together and are able to buy some houses, so they would live in a couple places around Istanbul. So they're able to pull together like that. And they had their own society that were able to protect themselves if need be, and were able to help each other out. They were able to help out other Africans, whether they were eunuchs or not. And a lot of people didn't know that they were doing this, and I did come across some material. As far as remnants of this, you can go to different places, for instance, and you can see the tombs of some of the Black eunuchs. Or if you go to some of the churches or mosques that have been converted to churches or whatever, in the backs you'll see the tombs of some of the eunuchs. And in some places you see signs that say that it was the eunuchs that converted the Christian churches from the previous empire to mosque.
Right.
And there's also the caravan stops on the way to Mecca and Medina. It was the eunuchs that built some of those caravan stops that are still there today that people can visit.
Oh, interesting.
George, I'll just ask one more question, and then we can do the quick fire thing and then jump into, because there's going to be tons of questions. So I guess my last question, George, is I'm curious how this book sort of informed your other scholarship. You know, you went back to the States. I'm curious what you learned from the process of writing about this subject and how it may have informed some of your other scholarship and what you might be working on next.
Yeah, one of the ways it informed me is that I was trying to figure out, I got all this history of these people, but one of the things that was left out is what about their personal lives? Mm-hmm. What were they thinking? And there's very little information on that. So when I came back to the United States, I was looking at the information about the Muslims that were enslaved in the United States. And in the southern plantations, for instance, large plantations, up to 20% of the slaves were African Muslims. Yep. And so I tried to find out, what were they thinking about? Their feeling of loss, their feeling of hope or non-hope. And I was able to take my questions from asking those about the Ottoman eunuchs to the United States. And I started looking up more information about, not that these were slaves, not that they were powerless, not that they were beaten, not that they were this and that, but what were they thinking about? And so that led me on another path, which I think is very important in looking at this particular topic.
Thanks so much. Let's get to the quick Q&A, and then we have a lot of comments from the groups. So first, what are you reading or watching right now that you think some of us might be interested in?
Oops. This is the book that I'm reading now. And it is Barracoon. Now, Barracoon is a cage on the African coast. The Europeans would lock the captured Africans into kind of a portable cage, and that was called a barracoon. And this book by Zora Neale Hurston, very famous African-American author, is the story of the last black cargo, is the subtitle. And this is the man who was one of the last known Africans brought to the United States. And that became very important because she interviewed this man in the 1920s when he was about 85 years old. It took 50 years for it to get published, but she asked him about his feelings. And then you get the sense that you can just try to put into other people's minds. He said every day he cried because he missed his parents, his brothers and sisters, and so forth. And that's something that's missing from the biographies of many of the eunuchs, the eunuchs in the Ottoman Empire, and also of the slaves in the United States. People talk about what they were doing, but they never asked them what they felt.
Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Past would be Manning Marable. Manning Marable is deceased. I knew him when he was a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder when I was there. He did a history of Malcolm X, for instance. He did a lot of writing. And he was one, because I used to see him in his office all the time, constantly digging for information, looking for articles, having his students try to find things from in libraries and other kinds of things. So he was on top of everything that he wrote. And that's the type of person I try to be. But that's the type of person that's very important when you're doing research, is to stay on it. Yeah. And like him, with this particular book, it was about 5 years before I was able to even start getting things down. And so he was one that was a model for me. To get
how do you spell his last name?
Marable. First name is Manning, Manning.
Great, perfect. So what do people most misunderstand about your work, or I guess your line of work?
I think a lot of misunderstandings come from the fact that Black history is not taught, for the most part, in schools in the United States. I teach a multiculturalism class, for instance, and may have 50, 60 students. And I ask them every semester, how many of you have studied African American history and culture, at least one class, ever in school? And out of the 50 or 60 hands, only 2 or 3 hands go up. How many of you studied Native American history and culture? No hands go up. So what we're dealing with is that this information, except for certain schools, is not out there. And so people have no context. So therefore, some of them don't like what I'm doing, misunderstand what I'm doing, have no knowledge at all to hook it onto them. And so that's probably where most of the misunderstanding comes from. It's not taught. It's not until they get to college that people are taught about these things.
It's so true. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
W.B. Du Bois is one that I look at. And I'll give you try to make it a short example. He wrote a book called The Philadelphia Negro around the turn of the 20th century. And he wanted to, this is the first time that anyone has done any research on Black health. That was part of it, not the whole thing. So he would go to a neighborhood in Philadelphia, Black neighborhood, knock on the door. People would say, answer the door, he'd say, I'm Dr. Du Bois, I'd like to interview you about this, and say, come on in, and everything was fine. Go to somebody else's house, knock on the door. I'm Dr. Du Bois, I want to interview you about this. No, go away. I don't want to talk. A few days later, knock, knock, knock. Door would open up. I'm Dr. Du Bois, have you changed your mind? I want to interview you. No, go away. 2 days later, knock, knock, knock. He got 100% participation in that Black neighborhood. And today when we do interviews like this, we're lucky if we get 25%. He got 100%. And that's why I admire him for not only what he did, the important writings that he did, but also his persistence.
I think Bedr is the first one. Bedr, if you want to unmute yourself, and then Yussi, and then Maisa.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. Very interesting parts of history that is completely, I guess, not a lot of people are not aware of. this is not necessarily a question, but like a comment about current media, where there's a lot of Turkish shows glorifying the Ottoman Empire and making heroes of out of some of the most kind of notorious villains of the Ottoman Empire. But there is never a mention, and I've watched a couple of them. There's also a few of them on Netflix now. There's never a mention of, or even a black person in any of the shows. And if you're saying that these black eunuchs, the chief black eunuch is the third most important bit, then yeah, media does not by any means discuss or talk about it or address it or acknowledge their presence whatsoever. So that's just an interesting place for more research for us, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, and there's a lot of room for that research. Anyone who wants to do it, because in my opinion, I just scratched the surface.
Mm-hmm. It is an interesting erasure. I mean, these shows almost exclusively take place, or most often take place, in the immediate entourage of the Sultan, in the harems, etc. And so, yeah, it's a notable erasure for sure.
George, you mentioned this in the sort of the quick Q&A. Since so many of these eunuchs may have been also, really well educated, did you rely on any sort of primary sources? You mentioned that there aren't any biographies. Were there journals that you found?
Yeah, there were some people who wrote some histories in the past. And again, it's pretty much cursory kinds of things. And it's only when you get to more recent times that you find people really delving into a lot of this. But there have been, one of the last of the eunuchs the last two of the eunuchs, chief black eunuchs, were interviewed by newspapers or magazines. And there's little scattered kinds of things that are out there. But again, it's difficult to pick up on. And then there are travelers' reports. So for instance, Richard Burton, not the actor, but the world traveler, he actually got to go to Mecca disguised as a Muslim. Well, he wrote down some interviews he did with some of the women that were in one of the harems, not in Istanbul, but and the other thing that we found out, which is very important from those interviews, is that many other eunuchs, they're usually depicted as being effeminate, but many of them had active sex lives. Okay, they didn't have what we call, quote unquote, the equipment, but they were still sexual beings, and some of them were married. And others tried to recreate family, just like the family they knew back in Africa. So you got a lot of different kinds of things that are going on in the lives of these people. And in fact, a couple of the harem women interviewed by Richard Burton said that the eunuchs made better lovers than their husbands after they got out of the place and married. That the eunuchs were better lovers because they knew how to use what we call, like, if you go to a sex shop, what they call devices and stuff like that, and knew how to do that. And there were some that were obviously homosexual, but many of them were masculine, just as anyone else, had the same desires. They had the libido. The libido wasn't taken away from them. And I also, when the high school I went to, was the school was connected to a hospital overseas, and I read some books about what happened in World War I when men encountered these landmines called bouncing Bettys that the Germans had. And a bouncing Betty would not just explode, but would rise from the ground, would be propelled up by a spring and explode almost right between a man's legs. And so everything was taken off. And what happened with them? Some of them weren't interested in sex at all for the rest of their lives. Some of them still had the drive. The drive was always there. So we also have to look at these people as being sexual beings. And many of them were, as we would call, straight, quote unquote. And some were homosexual, of course, but many were straight. But that's another aspect that I was able to pull out of this research.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You're up next.
Oh, thanks. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Well, this is such an interesting talk. I really appreciate it. I think, being raised in America, our concept of slavery is so different than the way it was practiced in the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire. So it's just a really interesting perspective. And I had a lot of questions. Unfortunately, I logged in late. So if you already answered them, you can just ignore it or direct me to something else. But were Black eunuchs ever used as spies by their native countries or by other countries because they had such access to power?
I haven't run across anything like that, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were.
And then my second question, I guess you kind of already answered about what happened to them after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, some of them were able to gain positions in other areas of the former empire. So they would go to Egypt or to some other places and get positions in the harems there. And then the ones that stayed in Istanbul, they were able to work together and find places to stay around the city. One of them, one of the last ones, he got a job teaching at a girls' school.
Huh.
And he also bought some cattle and some cows and was able to deliver milk. And he was one of the first ones using the milk bottle to put the it's like a cardboard cap at the top of the milk bottle to keep the milk from dripping out.
Uh-huh.
Milk bottles, you put like it's a heavy paper cap in it. And he was one of the first people to do that. So he had a business, he was a teacher and so forth. And other people, you even had a photograph of a group of harem women and some eunuchs that you showed earlier. Some of them went on tours, so to speak, in carnivals around Europe. And they were featured as the eunuchs and the harem women, because when the empire closed down, many women were not able to find relatives and didn't have anything to do. Yeah, that's the image. So you see the two eunuchs in the front and the harem women standing behind them. And some of these went on tour and carnival shows.
Oh.
So there's lots of different things that were happening with these people.
That's so interesting. And then were they ever able to buy their freedom if they had so much money? Was that popular? And if it wasn't popular, why do you think it wasn't popular?
Well, they didn't have to buy their freedom as much as I understand it. They were just freed. The Sultan's slaves were freed because the Sultan was dethroned. And so they were on their own pretty much after that.
Okay, and then I have one
Was manumission possible? Would manumission have been possible, let's say earlier on?
Oh, yes,
Or
definitely. And also, the difference between, you brought up a good point, because one of the differences between slavery in the Ottoman Empire and slavery as practiced in the United States is that slaves in the Ottoman Empire did have access to the court system if they were severely mistreated. It's not that many were able to do that, but at least there was that access. In the United States, there was no such access.
And then my final, it's kind of, I guess, a mix of possible research advice and a question. I was wondering if there was this an internal identity as Ottomans conceptually, or if it always felt as an outsider. And I also know there's this, this is so specifically random, there's a stream of Ottoman erotica fiction that was very popular in the late 1800s. And some of the stories are about women who marry eunuchs and have sex with them and that whole entire process. So I thought that's kind of it might be an interesting place to do research for internal dialogue or thoughts, or even in popular imagination at the time. But I was wondering if you had any knowledge of just how people felt. I think it's hard to know because there isn't much in the historical record about how they felt about themselves, if they had any kind of Ottoman identity. But I didn't know if you had any insight into that.
I haven't come across anything to do with erotica, but there has been an interview of a eunuch and his wife and how they married afterwards. They lived in a house in Istanbul, and they both talked about their sex life, their ongoing sex life. So that information is there without having to deal with a lot of the erotic stuff, per se. But again, the interviews of these people there's not that many, because they're more interested in the power position more than their personal lives. But there's a little bit of information, some of it is coming out now, about the sex lives of some of these people. I'll give you an example. There was European, he was in Egypt, I think it was, and he saw a eunuch in chains being shipped back to Istanbul because he was a slave of the chief Black Eunuch. And the reason was that he was in the harem, and a child was born that did not look like the Sultan of that particular community. It looked like him. So the doctors examined him and found out that instead of being completely castrated or emasculated, he had one undescended testicle that they missed. So usually about once a month in various harems, including in Istanbul later on, the center of the Ottoman Empire, of course, the eunuchs were examined at least once a month to make sure, quote, nothing had grown back.
Well, thank you so much. This was so informative. Thank you very, very much.
So Maisa had a question. She can't say it herself, so I'm going to say it. She was asking about, why was there this focus on castration, other than obviously the practical side that you just talked about of being able to go from the male side to the female side, the female quarters. But was there something also about a perception of the over-sexualized Black male and a way to sort of control or dehumanize their personhood, as a person?
Yeah, well, the white eunuchs, don't forget, they were there in large numbers and they were castrated. It's just that the Black eunuchs were completely emasculated. So looking at those two, you can't help but wondering, is it that they were more afraid or hated the idea of a woman being impregnated by a Black person than a white person? Or is there something else? Maybe that was the practice in Ethiopia that existed before the Ottoman Empire. You don't know, but you just go back and forth to try to figure out what in the world is going on with that. But there were white eunuchs as well in attendance in the palace. It's just that the Black eunuchs were the ones that were in the harem and the space of the Sultan. But outside of that space, in the palace area, there were Black and white eunuchs in those spaces.
First of all, I just want to thank Dr. Junne for this presentation. This was so eye-opening. I come from Lebanon, which was previously part of the Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm. And we studied the history of the Ottoman Empire in great details in school. But this never got picked up on the radar. So it was very eye-opening. Thank you so much for sharing the information. My question is, not specifically to you, Dr. Junne, although, of course, if you have information on this, please feel free to share it. But growing up in Lebanon, we had a lot of domestic workers at home and friends, and just in general, Lebanese people hire domestic workers quite often, and they almost always come from African countries. So now we have this inherited racism, sort of. It's very explicit in Lebanese community and generally in the Levant region. That sort of, it's racism, basically. That's what it is. And I wonder if that has some kind of tie to the Ottoman Empire and Lebanon being part of the Ottoman Empire in the past.
The racism was there. And another thing that is part of that is that a lot of times Black history is left out of the study in the Ottoman Empire and also in Turkey. So I've presented a couple papers on Blacks in Turkey. And one of the things I found out that I've written about, and there's even a photograph of him outside of my office in the hallway, is that in the First World War, there was a flying ace, a pilot, his mother had come to the Ottoman Empire as a slave. And he was a hero in the First World War. And I've shown this picture and talked about it to some Turks when I've been there, and nobody's heard of him. But I have his picture and his biography in a showcase outside of my doorway as one of the few Blacks that were fighter pilots in World War I. So I think what you're seeing is this handing down, perhaps, and I'm not going to say this is definitely everything, but the handing down, perhaps, of the feeling, the racist feeling against African people that has permeated a large part of the globe. And when people, and I don't think that people start off that way. I think that people are raised because they're told that Black people have no history, have no culture, and therefore they've done nothing. So they don't start off like, I'm going to be a racist. Is that's part of the education or indoctrination that many people receive.
Thanks so much for your talk, Dr. Junne. I myself study Ottoman history, and I had heard of the chief Black eunuch, but I was not aware that this was a widespread practice. So I'd like to ask about the lower level eunuchs, because I noticed from European antiquity where Black eunuchs were used as sex slaves by their male masters. Is this something you came across? And related to this, but somewhat apart, how was their gender perceived? Because in the Ottoman Empire, there are cases from various communities where the existence of a third gender is assumed. Did this apply to eunuchs, particularly Black eunuchs as well?
Yeah, the thing about sex slaves is that were there slaves the world over, you will have some that are going to be sex slaves. So it's nothing particular to the Ottomans or any other group. That's the way that things work. So depending what household that you would end up with, you could be a sex slave. And women, many times, were sex slaves too. Not just the African women, but also the European women could be sex slaves. So this is something that's general, is still going on. And there's also an international trade today in sex slaves. So that hasn't died out. That's still there, unfortunately. And the eunuchs, they can be seen, and the term that's sometimes used is the third sex. And some people would categorize the eunuchs under that. But we also have to remember at the same time that some were more homosexual, there were some that were heterosexual, and there was others that had no sexual desires at all. So whatever label that we put under them, we have to remember that there's a spectrum of people, and we have no idea what that spectrum is because people were not interviewed and we don't really know, but we have to keep that in mind. So you raised some pretty good questions, because if the person wanting a male slave, that the guy wanting a male slave was homosexual, there was nothing that the African guy could do about it at all. So that's what we're looking at.
I was wondering, particularly in light of what's happening in the US these days, I'm speaking from Philadelphia, if you think that the practice surrounding Black eunuchs says anything about the ways in which humans dehumanize other humans in general, and how we can understand sort of, dehumanization of humans in a better way, looking at history like this.
Okay. I grew up 26 miles from Philadelphia in New Jersey. Okay. But anyway, with, I think understanding more deeper the history of Black people generally, the more that some of those old ways of looking can come to an end, or at least be reduced. So that's what we're seeing. So studying the Black eunuchs means that in Turkey, for instance, not just Turkey, but looking at Turkey, for instance, I think that would lead people to, if they understand the history and the culture, to have more respect for who these people are because they'll be understanding them. The same as in the United States. If people looked at the history of African people and saw the things that they have done to build the United States, they would have more respect for Black people in the United States. But again, hardly anybody knows this. And the last thing I want to say is, we're looking at the book that I've done and some other writings that I've done. I say for students that this is an area that's still open, and they're going to find out new information. They'll be able to have more access, and maybe they'll find out that some of the stuff I have in my book is false or not up to date. But anyway, there's a big field out there for people to study and can do excellent research. So encourage students, if they want to get into this area, to do that.
Great. Thanks, Camila, for the question. Dr. Junne, thank you so much for joining us. Your perspective is really valuable, and thanks so much for answering all our questions.
And thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.